going to kick straight into part one, which is the practical components of writing your entry. In this space, we're going to confirm what it takes to be eligible. There's full terms and conditions, but we'll deal with the primary points. We'll look at how to select the category that you put your entry forward for, how you prepare your entry from a literal where do you put what sort of point of view, some tips for telling your story, making your point, what we will do in terms of assessing what you submit and what the judges will be looking for, and then also just the simple process of submitting your entry, which to confirm is free for everybody until the 13th of June. So firstly, confirming your eligibility. There are not many requirements. These are detailed in the terms and conditions, but in principle the things you need to remember are the following. The work must have taken place in the past 3 years, and that's with the intention of ensuring that the validity is current, right? So that the stories that we take from the awards and then share with others represent a realistic and current practice as opposed to a legacy of practice. Furthermore, we ask that additional results must have been measured or reported in the last 12 months prior to submission. This is a simple requirement because what we could find is that the same entries could enter year on year on year with the same content and perhaps even be winners year on year, but not have necessarily advanced the work. So what we're asking is that even if you've entered previously and you re-enter the exact same work, that's not a problem as long as something additional has happened since the last entry, which demonstrates progress that's taken place in the year since the last awards. We also have a requirement that submission should include work or pertain to work that happened in the UK. Now, we have global organizations entering who have done work on a global scale, which is fine. We have UK-based consultants who consult to clients in other countries, and we have other countries who or consultancies from other countries who may have been working for clients in the UK. We're simply asking for that reference to the UK because we can only claim to set a standard for British people by British standards based on the British-based judges that we have and their British understanding of what is an appropriate deployment of business psychology in our market. Our concern is that if we try to set standards for other markets, we may lack sensitivity to the particular nuances of that market. They may be much more or less mature in their extensions of business psychology interventions, and so we could bring disparity into the judging unintentionally. And so to avoid that, we're calling out the fact that we're a British-based competition with a British-based judging panel, and therefore we propose that people that want to sign up to those standards are the ones that make the entries. The entry deadline is the 13th of June, and we would only extend that under exceptional circumstances and if advised in advance. So hopefully you'll all meet that deadline. Otherwise, do write to us as soon as you can. And also ensure that you have the permission of the parties that are mentioned in the entry, because we are, if you become a finalist, we can publicize any information that you've included in the entry. So at that point, you would want to be sure that if, for example, you've written on behalf of a client, that they have approved the messages that you've shared. Okay, a little bit of the dull stuff. Let's get into the slightly more interesting stuff. The selection of a category may not sound like a complicated thing, but I wanted to give you a bit more information about the considerations that you might take in selecting your category. There are technically 7 categories. 6 specialist areas, and then an overall one. So we've got excellence in assessment. So this is about how you've assessed incumbents or recruits or managers or leaders or groups, and for whatever reason, right? There's excellence in change management. Again, no matter what the reason for the change was, you could find that that category is useful. Coaching and or training, which can be a developmental intervention, a classroom intervention, an online intervention. There's no limit to that, but coaching and or training is one of the categories. Excellence in engagement, broadly, which again can be embeddedness and other versions of engagement. Excellence in health, well-being or inclusiveness is an option, again, for that broad spectrum, which includes D&I. And excellence in performance improvement. So principally, we're suggesting that the majority of entries, in fact, principally all the entries to date, will fall into one of those broad 6 categories. They have been in place for the last 2 years, and we found good commitment to all of them. What we have additionally is an innovation category and the chairman's choice category. Now, all of the categories in the first year were judged against the same criteria, including a requirement or a rating for innovation. But what we found was it's not necessarily fair to rate particularly innovative projects as against the same criteria as others, because what you'll find is there may be a difference in evidence collection because of the innovative mechanism, and there are things that could advantage or disadvantage innovative entries. So we've separated that out so that we are only comparing the most innovative with the most innovative rather than across the patch with people who are going ahead with good tried and true methods of the likes of assessment or engagement or well-being and so on. The Chairman's Choice Award is typically a culmination of all of the other categories put together, not necessarily only the winners, but generally the entries that have really stood out as being exceptional that year. If you have an entry that is directly relevant to business psychology that you can't find another relevant category for, then you can make your entry requesting that it be entered directly into the Chairman's Choice Award category. However, we don't typically announce the shortlist for that until the night of the awards, and at that point, any and every other entry will also automatically, if they've made finalists, be considered for the Chairman's Choice category. So what I thought you might find useful is to understand a little bit about how the entries have worked in the past, so that you can also recognize where you're likely to get the most competition for entries that you might make. So what you'll see here is, and this is a percentage scale, not a numbers of entry scale, is that excellence in coaching and training gets a lot of attention every year. So there's a lot of business psychology practitioners who classify the success they have under broadly having coached or trained or developed other individuals. So that is a category which on the one hand gets a lot of competition, but on the other hand it's very likely to be subdivided because we'll get so much attention for it. And the second most popular category both years to date has been assessment. So again, because there's a mix of recruitment assessment, leadership assessment, incumbent assessment, we'll find that a lot of people will enter that area. The other categories have shifted around over the years. In change management was really popular in the first year as opposed to, and in the second year. Engagement also features quite predominantly, but we had somewhat less activity in the performance improvement categories and health, well-being, and inclusiveness. Sufficient entries to subdivide in both cases, but not necessarily the highest levels of competition there. So if you have done, for example, assessment, but in the interest of improving performance, you may very well want to actually consider using the performance improvement category if you've got business metric outcomes that show that your intervention has improved performance, instead of simply the assessment category. Or, you know, again, if you've done an engagement survey but you've done that in the interest of well-being, or you've taken a well-being index from that, you may choose to suggest that your entry can be relevant to that category too. So I'm just going to show you then what the basic, what happens once you've chosen a category for entry, right? We will get all of the submissions in by the end of the day on the 13th of June. At that time, we go through and we do an initial assessment. We check eligibility, we check word counts, we check things like that to be sure that the judges are seeing and assessing things fairly, that are appropriate standards to enter. And we then look at all of the various categories that people have suggested. So you can absolutely put 2, 3, 4 different categories on your entry if you feel it may qualify for more than one. What we will then do is say no matter how many you have chosen, we'll consider all of them, and we'll make an assessment based on the competition for the year, which is most likely to be a fair benchmark and comparison group for your entry. And it's on that basis that we will allocate you to the entry category to which you're best suited in context of other entries for the year. So we will give you the best possible chance of winning, but you might just want to expand our perspectives on which of those categories you might find useful, because we will typically choose from a category that you've suggested in the first place. So you can enter as many times as you like with different pieces of work, but if you're entering a single piece of work, you only need to enter once for multiple categories to be considered, and then we will tell you, and we will categorize, if you are a finalist, only one of those to be your finalist category. Okay. That is the type of thing some people get a little confused about. Does anybody want to ask any questions on that? I'm not sure. If you could type them into the text, that would be useful. Okay. Not seeing messages on the text, but do feel free to prompt there if you have questions. So let me just show you what also happens. So what we do find then is, based on the entries each year, a different sort of theme may come through from one year to the next. So what we've done in previous years is looked at different ways to subdivide the categories, again to ensure that we're being as fair as possible in comparing people with their peers rather than necessarily sort of unfair comparisons. So a good example of that is that the assessment category has been split in previous years. In the first year, we had a lot of entries that pertained to leadership assessment. Leadership is really quite a different, often very different approaches, multi-layered approaches are taken for leadership assessment, for instance. So there we separated those assessment entries out from the others because we felt it meant we could focus more directly on the unique traits of leadership assessment. We didn't have that so much in the second year. Actually, more of that leadership in kind of content came through in the coaching section. But we nevertheless split between assessing incumbents and assessing employees and assessing for recruitment. So in both years, we took it upon ourselves to suggest it would be fairer to compare subcategories of assessment rather than the whole frame. So this year again, we will make a decision based on the number of entries we receive and the variety that we see within each category, what subdivision may be appropriate. You can see that the coaching and training category was split to 4 categories the first year. It was split in 2 for the second year. Similarly, the health and well-being with inclusiveness category has been split both years to address health and well-being separately from inclusion and diversity. Okay, so you are welcome to enter as many categories as you like, and you can make multiple entries, but each of your entries will, as in each story that you have to tell, will be limited to 1. One of the questions we had in one of the previous sessions and last year as well was, if I've done a really, really big project, can I enter one big project with multiple categories? And yes, you can do that. So you might want to write, maybe you were doing change management, which included coaching, and employee engagement surveys. So you might want to write 1 change management entry and 1 employee survey entry, or you might want to write 1 coaching entry and 1 engagement entry. So if you've got sufficient evidence to support the quality of the work you did or to demonstrate the impact that you had, you might want to split that evidence out into more than 1 entry. But if actually your evidence is fairly light, then you'll be best served keeping all of the data in 1 entry so that you make maximum impact for the work that you did. Okay. Now, this might sound like I'm being obvious, but I just want to clarify one thing that a lot of people are concerned about in making the entry, and that is the names and the descriptions that go on to the entry form. So first off, bear in mind the first thing, which is please provide a title for your submission. This is what everybody will hear about your submission. So make that meaningful. Don't make it 20 words long, but do make it meaningful. If you just go, my submission is assessment by Thomas International, then, you know, that's fine, but it's not really compelling. So it might be establishing career paths for finance professionals at Unilever. Makes that a little bit more compelling. So kind of make it meaningful, but don't go over the top, right? But that is something that will be announced on the shortlist as to why you got selected too. So if you want that, you know, you think about what you want, what title for the work you want associated with your brand when finalists are announced. In section 1, okay, so then what you'll also see is you can enter to be a conference speaker only on this entry form. You can do an awards entry only, or you can do both. So please feel free to tick whichever suits you in the middle of the page. Then with the Your Details section, section 1, what we want there is the contact details of the person who is physically going to manage the entry process. That is the person that we will write to say thank you, we've received your entry. It's the person we will write to tell you the judge's decision, and it's the person that we will write to follow up on potentially booking events and things like that, right? This is not the person who will be announced on the night as the winner. This is not the person, the name that goes here is not going to be shared with the public. What was here is just the administrator. So if 6 people did the work, don't put 6 people's name here. We don't need it. We need 1 that we can just keep in touch with. So just put the most, the sort of facilitator's role name down here and contact information, right, and phone number. Then you have a completely different section which says that if your award is shortlisted, and if indeed we announce on the night, what names would you like mentioned? So at that point you could say we want Bob and Fran and Raj from the team at Unilever, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. You can write whatever you like there. Of course we want to try and engrave it on a trophy hopefully for you, so try not to make it too crazy long because that gets a bit tricky. But bear in mind that this is the people that you really want to acknowledge on the night. If you were called to the stage or if you're announced, when you're announced as a finalist on the night, you know, what are the names that you want to be sure are recognized there. So expand on the details there. And finally, if you have logos for your business, if you're a consultant working with an in-house service, a company, with a company, you might want to put your consultancy logo as well as the organization's logo. Whatever you choose, just make sure that the logos are in a decent graphic quality there so that we can copy and paste them for use on the evening announcing the shortlist, on our websites announcing the shortlist, on our Twitter tiles, and so on. Okay. I know that may seem straightforward, but I do find people get the naming thing a little confused, so I hope that makes it a touch clearer. So to section 3, which is where you actually write your entry itself, right? You've got a total of 1,600 words allowed here. And supporting material. So there are 6 areas where you're invited to enter content. First is the overall project summary. Second is the challenge. Third is your approach. Fourth is your outcome evaluation. Fifth is any supporting material. And sixth is acknowledgements. The 3 sections, challenge, approach, and outcome, are the only ones that are evaluated and rated by the judges. The others are not. So you need to be sure that your entry can stand without the judges reading the rest. They typically do read the rest, but the principle is that we will judge what's put into those core areas because that's the criteria that we use. So first you get to write 100 words on your overall context. That's really up to you to just use to bring your entry to life, but really focus on providing the evidence the judges are looking for within the challenge, approach, and outcome section. You can use up to 1 page of supporting materials. That might be, for example, a model that you use, you know, a graphic that you often use to bring your content to life to your clients. And finally, acknowledgements. That's if you want to respectfully reference other people whose work has inspired you, people who've helped the team, helped get outcomes done, support from executives, those types of things. Some people have thanked their parents. And as and when people are made finalists, when we publish the awards book, then those acknowledgements will also be printed. Okay. Again, I'm not seeing any messages on the chat and queries. I'm hoping that that means people are following, but we will be sure to let Stuart open the line a bit later to get to questions. So for now, in the challenge section, what you want to remember here is to position what you are focused on during the intervention. So when it comes to assessing whether or not you met your needs in the outcome section, it's going to be based on what you set out to achieve. So if you set out to achieve the deployment of a competency model in 12 countries, then what we're going to look for evidence of in the outcome is that indeed you achieved the deployment of an effective competency or validated competency model in 12 countries. So you need to tell us up front what you were trying to achieve. At the end, if you've actually managed to get to 24 countries in the same time frame, we'll recognize that that was above and beyond expectations. Similarly, if you say that, well, we only made 6 due to the following constraints, we'll again recognize it in context of the demand. So do be sure that you call out what it was that you had set out to achieve. The evidence that suggested that a good way to do that would be using models from business psychology. And then also quite critically, mention who the stakeholders were in the work. This is the type of thing that doesn't necessarily get covered in typical occupational psychology courses or industrial organizational courses. The fact that business psychologists are working in organizations, they're expecting a commercial reward to be funded by a commercial enterprise in most instances. And as a result, we have a responsibility to work as professional business people, not simply as psychologists that have maybe just individual interests at heart. So in that context, we absolutely expect that people will have accounted for their stakeholders. That may be near-term stakeholders. If it's a consultancy, it may be the client. It may be the broader HR function, the broader business, It may even be the community in which that business operates. In the entry that, for example, that we had from Apps to Development that won in the leadership or change category in 2014, that was for Allied Irish Bank, and the entire Irish sovereignty was at stake because of the damage that had been done by the bank's leadership failures, according to the Troika, and that's really where the stakeholder management had to start, getting the public to believe that the bank could be different. So mention the stakeholders, because how you engage with them is going to affect the professionalism that the judges see in your work. The next section is the approach. This is about what action you took, why you took it. Here we really want to see not just that you used tools or techniques or models and which ones you used, but how you used them and why you used them. So this is also about demonstrating the evidence base that you had for what you deployed. What we don't want is the assumption that a model is valid and that therefore you just used it. We want to see that you actually used a model that was indeed valid. Let me give you an example. Last year we had one of our judges last year, and this again is Donald Taylor. Donald is an absolute leading thinker and extremely involved at the forefront of the learning industry. He's the chair of several of the learning councils in this country, and what he was saying was several of the entries in the learning and training category reference the use of learning styles as a mechanism for effective deployment. Now, learning styles is an interesting framework that can be quite useful potentially for framing interventions, but it's not a sound predictive evidence-based model that suggests you will have better or worse results. And people making the assumption that mentioning they were using learning styles was actually making it psychologically evidence-based was really letting their entries down, because that simply isn't the case. Similarly, with people who are using tools from neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, there's a lot of content in NLP that has been validated through other mechanisms, coaching and change, for example. But NLP as an overall construct has not had much validation at all. That's not to suggest it's not valid, it's to suggest that a cautious consultant or psychologist should think twice before using it without checking its validity. So be sure that you don't simply reference the models, but you reference your belief in the model as in the evidence base for its use. And hopefully that is actually contextually relevant, or how you yourself concurrently validated it during the work that you were doing. In terms of expectations, that's about stakeholders again, setting and meeting the expectations of your stakeholders. And this is also around time management and project deployment. It's about doing things in stages that are logical and practical, and making sure that you've had a professional approach to how you've deployed that work systematically, managing for risks and dependencies and that sort of thing. Finally, to the outcome evaluation. This is again very much in context of the ask that we saw in the challenge, right? So we need to see that what you're measuring as success was indeed what the stakeholders had wanted, was against the timelines that you had set for yourself, and was over the audience frame with the criteria for success that had been set out in the challenge space. We also do suggest that you consider mentioning the learning that you've derived from the work. So even if something went wrong, reflecting on how you would do things differently, or indeed the plan you've made for remedy in the short term, it demonstrates professional conduct, and that is appropriate. And similarly, controlling for other explanations. If you've made significant change in an organization, it's very likely that multiple things could be to some extent attributed for the value delivered. So be sure that you're clear on what you're taking credit for and how you believe that you can evidence that that was a result of your work, as opposed to just general change in the broader sense. Okay. Still not seeing questions, so I will continue. A couple of simple pointers, and this is just common sense, I suppose. Write in plain English. The use of jargon may be quite useful for those who are really in the know, but we're trying to ask that we prepare entries that are fit for consumption by the general public. We want any consumer, especially in an HR team or a manager who's maybe never used any psychological tools before, to be able to pick up an entry and say, wow, I can see now and I can understand how psychology could change the way that I work or the quality of experience for my workforce. So don't talk with the assumption that you're talking to the judges. Talk with the assumption that anybody should be able to pick up your work and understand and respect the impact that you had. So choose your evidence wisely. Your most valid evidence should be the evidence that you share, bearing in mind that there's tight word counts. And don't make assumptions that people will understand things. Rather be clear. If you say you used a model in a particular context, say what it was, what the model was for, and why and how it was used. Okay. Then what's going to happen is the judges are going to look at 6 different aspects of effectiveness in the work that you submit. So be sure you answer these questions when you're writing your 3 sections, right, for judging. Firstly, what was the relevance to business psychology? This is what you'll cover in your challenge section. Why did we feel that this was a psychologist, that business psychology should be part of the solution to the circumstances? Evidence of stakeholder management, you can mention it in every section of the entry. What and how did you take people with you? Who was involved and what were their interests and how were they met? Evidence of effective execution of the project, again, that's about being professionals. It's about taking time seriously, it's about taking money seriously, it's about taking objectives seriously and doing the best we can to operate legitimately and respectfully within the organizations that are paying the bill for what we do, whether that's a salary or whether it's a consulting bill. Evidence of the application of conceptual models, that's going to come largely through your approach section, and then the evidence that they worked is going to come through in your evaluation in your outcome section. So be sure to expand on those. And then the extent of impact that you had is a measure that is uniquely taken against yourself, right? So we look at what you positioned that you needed to achieve in part 1 in the challenge, and we look at the extent to which you achieved that when you describe your outcomes. It's important to bear this in mind because we will have organizations that enter having done work that affected 1 million people, and there will also be others who enter that did work that affected 1, 2, 3, or 4 people, and both are equally legitimate. So if you did good work on whatever scale, be sure to call that out. So just for a case in point, Fiona Parashar was one of the winners with leadership development in 2014, and she did great work, but it was with 4 directors. But by the end of the work, she had set out to help these 4 directors re-engage their workforce, re-engage themselves, and turn their business around to get it fit for growth through greater delegation and trust. And indeed, within 6 months of the intervention, she could show that the business had grown 25%. So that's a fantastic example of a very small-scale intervention, perhaps, that turned a lot of people's lives around, as in context of to the extent that she meant to, right? That same year, the winner in the assessment category for recruitment was McDonald's, who were assessing 20,000 people a month. So again, much bigger scale, but then their evidence had to support that that had a positive impact on that greater scale. If you believe that something you've done is particularly innovative, you will be marked against those same 6 criteria, and you will additionally be marked against the extent to which it is innovative, what you did. And only if the judges believe and agree with you that in fact you were innovative will you be kept in the category for innovation. So innovation category entrants get 7 marks as opposed to the rest of the entrants that get 6. Okay, this is an example of the rating scales that we share with the judges. The judges get broader briefings, and obviously they have their own body of knowledge to refer to. But I just wanted to show this to you just as 2 illustrations to demonstrate this is not mystical, this is not obscure. We're being really transparent. If we tell you we're looking for evidence of stakeholder management or engagement, we're honestly telling the judges give a low rating if they've not talked about it, there's been limited involvement of people, and give a high rating if there's strong evidence of co-creation, ongoing consultation, and comprehensive conversation. And that's what we really want you to take a step back and think about. When you read your entry, can you see, against the 6 criteria, which are what we've painted here, could you see logically that each of those boxes could be ticked, and not just ticked, but also ticked to the best of the evidence that you have for the work you did? Similarly, project execution by way of example. Okay, I'm not getting any questions on chat, so thank you all for your patience and sticking with me. I hope you're finding some useful content here as we go ahead. Bear in mind the word counts. We ask your overall project summary be no more than 100 words. Across the next 3 areas, the challenge 400 words, the approach 600, and the outcome 500 words. If you do 503 words, or you do 602 in one and 498 in the next, that's all right. We actually allow up to 5 or 10%, but never more than 10% leeway on the word count. So I'm not encouraging you to go over. I'm just suggesting, If it means you can put one more layer of evidence or line of evidence into your evaluation for an extra 10 words, that's okay. But if you do exceed by more than about 10%, it starts to be unfair that you've been able to present more data than other competitors. So in those cases, we would need to reject the entries. Or otherwise, as happened in one case, we reserve the right to just remove portions of the evidence. That, but that happened only ever once, and I really don't want to have to edit other people's entries because you might not find that you would agree with what we take out. Okay, so supporting materials are not assessed. Please don't put in more than a page. But if you've got, a link to a video that maybe you recorded with people talking about the intervention, or you've got, as I say, a model that you use, or an organizational structure of how the people that were affected in the change, it should be interesting rather than material to the entry, but you can use an additional page for that. And finally, it's really straightforward. Save it in Word. Do not PDF it. We need to be able to copy and paste from it constantly. So just save it as a Word document and send it to the admin team by the 13th of June, and you will then be entered. Bearing in mind that on the back page, it does show the commitments that you're making to terms and conditions. So have a look at those just to be sure. Okay. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I wanted to use this time to show you some examples that have been better and less well received by the judges, to give you a sense of the sort of thing that generally you might want to consider including. So the first piece is setting up your entry in your project summary. This is where you get to sort of give some context to people who may know nothing about the business that you are working in or the organization. They may know nothing about you as an individual. They may know nothing about any variety of things, industry, relevant content, and so on. So we have an example here on the left-hand side, which was from the Johnson's Control entries, which shows very specifically and practically what PMSL were doing with Johnson Controls, and it shows the relationship between the two organizations. That's absolutely fine. You can see on the other hand, however, and Johnson Controls was a finalist, so the work that was done there was absolutely great. On the other hand, we've got ETL Draw's entries, overall introduction or some summation of it on the right-hand side. And you can see how ETL immediately drew real storytelling guys into what he did. Now, he not only won his category that year, but he also won the Chairman's Choice Award. Some of you may have seen him featured recently in the CIPD magazine, because he's done fantastic stuff, not just in forensics, but in training generally around the world. But he really painted a picture here about the fact that forensics experts might be perceived as objective because they wear white gloves, or they, we see CSI in Miami and CSI New York and CSI whatever, and we think that these criminal and forensic investigators are very objective. But the fact is that they're not. And until he could help them realize that they had cognitive biases that may result in them discounting evidence, they were actually shortchanging the investigations, and at times that had affected judgments in court. So he really starts to paint that picture in a meaningful way, which sets you up for the expectation that the work he did was really important. Now, I don't believe that the Johnson's Control work was any less important, but you can see that the language usage does really enrich the experience for the judge to get them on side with the fact that they should prepare to hear quite a compelling story. So really use this intro framing piece to get them to care about the work as much as you care about it when you did it. Okay, this again is an example. The entry on the left, very practical, very factual. It's not particularly exciting. I wrote it myself, so I can take the criticism. It was a finalist, but it wasn't a winner. It was kind of interesting. I mean, I'm really passionate about the Regis story, but I definitely didn't convey that in my opening project summary for the entry for them. So I would suggest look on the other hand at how the YSC entry for the pit stop program for Unilever instead really brought to life that people, this was something that was going to change their lives. And that really is exciting when we think about business psychology, how people's feedback from family and colleagues and so on could help them advance in their careers. Okay, those sections were not assessed, but now we get onto the sections that are assessed. So, for example, the challenge. And this is where we ask, did you make your case for having used business psychology? There are multiple ways that you can do that, because in every case we've got our own reasons for having brought a psychological model to bear, and whether that's an engagement model or an assessment model or a coaching model or whatever. These are all very legitimate and valid, but the intention is to really paint the picture of the platform that you are working on. So here again we've got the story from Fiona Parashaw, which just is the very human element of the directors feeling overstretched and asking for help, and her approaching that in a one-to-one way. On the other hand, you've got the sense of Allied Irish Bank, where we had to work with 14,000 people. Well, absolutely. So Steve there was painting the picture of a much broader failure of leadership, individually and collectively in banking, and actually kind of demonstrating there that that may not have been the most typical place to see psychology as the answer to banking sector problems, but in fact, when you look at it, the strategy was around changing the culture, which, as he says in his last paragraph, and changing behavior, and that immediately makes it something that psychologists would have expertise in. So be sure to make your submission really compelling and bring it to life with relevant context at this point. And again, fillers are a waste of words, so keep it really relevant to the psychology. And remember that in the challenge section, you're setting up standards for your entry to be assessed and your outcomes to be assessed. So the more you can be clear in what you are trying to achieve, the more likely you are to have the judges easily recognize how much you did get done. So if you were trying to move sales figures from 1 million to 1.2 million, set up that requirement for that 20% increase. If you were trying to move your engagement benchmark or move yourselves past the average benchmark or higher, you've got to say, this is why we were doing this leadership intervention. We wanted the engagement of our staff because we believed that was going to affect our commercial position. And as a result, we're then measuring in relation to that we did or potentially exceeded the goal we'd set for ourselves, or that we came real close, or well-being, or whatever it might be. Be sure that you've said who's going to be involved, how they're going to be involved, what effect you're going to have, what measures you're going to have. Then the judges know what to look for when it gets to the end. In the approach section, I have said this 3 times, I'm going to say it once more time, please do consider the evidence and the application of the models. So I think that if you look at what's on the left-hand side and you think about what I've said to you already in the writing, mentioning that you used a lot of models, that's useful, but actually showing how you applied them is far more useful, right? So what we have on the left-hand side is an example of a lot of models that were deployed, but we don't know inside the mind of this business psychologist, who's an extremely experienced business psychologist, and she's seen this example being used because she was on one of the training courses previously. She recognized that, she knew how to bring all of that together, but she didn't necessarily make that self-evident to the judges, that she had this really complex, layered approach. On the left-hand side, however, you can see the work that was done by the winner in the leadership development category that year, which was Steve Apps, the chair of the association now, with Zurich, working with the Zurich Leadership Framework. And he's really simply put together, well, we used self-managed learning, we used this model, this is how we used the model, we used Kolb's learning styles, and we used it and deployed it in a certain way. So it's really clear, rather than complexity and just throwing a lot of words out there, it tells the judges, these are the steps we took, and this is what we did with the evidence that we started with. Okay. If I go to the next one. And please just bear in mind, all of the examples I'm sharing with you have been finalists. I'm not sharing them in full. They're available in full in the book that you can read. But I'm not criticizing them overall. I'm simply suggesting that the ones that are worth emulating are those that were actually the runners-up and the winners each year, because evidently they achieved better ratings from the judges. What I like in these 2 examples, again, is the systematic addressing of the opportunities, showing in the first instance, in the left-hand example, there were modules and there was progressive deployment with spaced learning. The example on the right from YSC there, where they worked with Diageo on deep dive coaching sessions, followed with planning sessions, followed with business partner sessions. And it kind of again shows stakeholders were engaged and taken along with them. The individual's experience was managed and progressive. That's evidence of thoughtfulness, and it gives opportunity for risk management, and it gives opportunity for progressive success. when we get to the outcome, there's so many ways that you can tell your story, and it really depends what story you have to tell. But I would suggest that we don't see winners or finalists, definitely not runners-up and winners, that haven't got some numbers in there. So there's qualitative measures, which might mean opinion-based. They might be feedback and survey-based, as opposed to quantitative measures, which are very literal significance data that you might get off psychometrics and the like. But consider how you can bring your best evidence to bear. There's not rights or wrongs, but if you haven't actually made a measure that demonstrated specific commencement and conclusion with a shift between, then that would not stand up well for the judges who are looking for evidence that you had an impact specifically. In this case, again, it's a different type of evidence that ETL Draw was sharing. So on the one hand, he was saying, look, I'm entering the training category, and I can assure you that my training was well rated. He shared in his supporting materials copies of what he had got from Quantico. He was working with the FBI in Quantico, and he had ratings from the individuals who had attended the course. And even these really skeptical forensic investigators were rating him kind of 4 out of 5 out of 5 on all of these dimensions, and actually often 4 out of 4.8 and 4.9 out of 5. But actually what he also brought to bear, which isn't something that's numerical to be fair, was how the work that he had done had actually resulted in a change in regulation. And that kind of thing, you don't need numbers to express that, but it's the kind of evidence that, again, is compelling. Business psychology can improve working lives, and it can change organizations and their futures and their success. So if you have something compelling that is an external and maybe non-psychological validation, such as something huge like changing regulation, do feel free to include that, but recognize that it might not be the only evidence to include, because we are, after all, looking for proof that psychology made a difference, not simply that you made a difference. And here again, there's an example of quantitative assessment with sales figures that were increased, as well as people attitudinally being assessed. So you've got a mix there between the hard dollars and cents, or pounds and pence, increase of 30%, but also the gain in people's ability to cope, which is a more personalized, subjective measure. And also there's nice quotes in that one, and a lot of people do include quotes. Quotes are a great supplement to your evidence, but please don't limit your evidence solely to quotations about clients or individuals in the organization being satisfied. Well, I mean, if that's all you've got, it's a good start, but it's not going to be as strong as some others, I suggest. And that is what I had to share. What I did want to remind you of is that the conference is happening on the 13th and 14th of October. You'll be able to meet a lot of the other finalists there, so absolutely save those dates in your diary. The awards event is on the night of the 13th, and you're going to want to be there to hear if you're a winner. And if you want to get more of a sense of what has been entered in the past, the 2015 book is not complete yet, but the 2014 awards book is complete, so you can download that. If you have Kindle or the Kindle app, you can get that off Amazon. Please feel free to do so.